Welcome to the MAPS Podcast, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Hello, friends, and welcome to the MAPS Podcast. This is Zach Leary, your host, and this is episode 46 of the MAPS Podcast, which features an all-new interview with the great, insightfully wise author Michael Pollan, who talks about his new book, This Is Your Mind on Plants. So we'll get into more of that in a little bit. But of course, as always, please visit maps.org to sign up for the MAPS newsletter, which is a really great way to keep up with everything happening in the MAPS universe, but also to sign yourself up to become a regular supporter of MAPS through a monthly contribution. This money goes directly to support psychedelic research and shifts in psychedelic policy on both the federal and state level. Your money is well spent, trust me on that. Speaking of policy, yes, MAPS was awarded a grant, a $12 million grant from Michigan to expand cannabis research for veterans with PTSD. The program, which was funded by adult use marijuana retail taxes, is designed to evaluate the efficacy of marijuana in treating the medical conditions of U.S. Armed Services veterans and preventing veteran suicide. The grant will fund phase 2 clinical trials comparing the safety and efficacy of cannabis against placebo for treatment of PTSD among veterans. Really, really important stuff. And simultaneously, the House of Representatives passed House Resolution 4502, which directs the National Health Institute agencies for the first time to undertake and fund research into psychedelic-assisted therapies and potential benefits of cannabis. If enacted, some of the nearly $150 million funding allocated for PTSD research may eventually advance research into psychedelic-assisted therapy for PTSD. Now, I know a lot of people within the psychedelic community who listen to this podcast and who don't kind of view the political spectrum as an oppositional force, right? But when it comes to the advancement of psychedelics, I highly encourage you to rethink that and to show support for these bills that are popping up all over the place on the state level and federal level by writing your local congressperson. It really does equate to a means to an end. This, psychedelic research, which is funded and passed and supported on a federal and statewide level legally, will go to support the cognitive liberty discussion in the long run. So, these forces really work together, and I think Rick Doblin has done a fantastic job of articulating and architecting that vision from the get-go when MAPS was first started in 1986. So, just wanted to throw that out there. And also, if you go to maps.org and click on the news tab, there's lots of listings of great events happening around the globe. And most importantly, though, Psychedelic Science will be happening June 18th through the 25th, 2023 in Denver, Colorado. So be sure to check back for more information on that. But there's all sorts of stuff happening in your neighborhood, no matter where you are, where you can go and learn and gather in community and really expand your own personal knowledge and maybe even your consciousness, if you're lucky, about how psychedelic consciousness can benefit your life. So be sure to check that out. So before we get into the podcast with Michael Pollan, I wanted to share something with you from Stanislav Grof, who's talking about non-ordinary states of consciousness.
I was very, very dissatisfied with the fact that traditional psychiatrists call these states altered states, I see it in a kind of a pejorative term that doesn't reflect, how much respect I have for them. It implies somehow that we have certain correct way of experiencing ourselves and the world, and then these are distorted. These are sort of improper ways of experiencing ourselves and the world. So I was calling them non-ordinary state, together with many of my colleagues who did some consciousness research. But I was particularly interested in these non-ordinary states that are healing, that are transformative, that are potentially evolutionary, and that also have what we call heuristic value, which is that they can bring absolutely new information about the psyche, about human nature, about the nature of reality. So those would be states that, for example, the shamans experience as part of the initiatory crisis, or states that native cultures experience in rites of passage or some other powerful rituals, the kind of states that the initiates experience in ancient mysteries of death and rebirth in Egypt, in Greece and other places, the experiences that people have in different forms of yoga, in different forms of Buddhism, the Sufis experience, the Christian mystics, the Kabbalists, and so on. And it was just unbelievable to me that we don't have a special name for them. We put everything into that one bag of altered states, and the implication is that they are all pathological. You see, we don't have a category, a spiritual experience, a mystical experience. So anybody who has any kind of episode of non-ordinary states would be seen as mentally ill and would be getting medication and a diagnosis and so on. So when we did a lot of work with these states and we discovered the healing and the transformative potential, we started calling these spontaneous states spiritual emergencies or psychospiritual crisis. And so much of our work was actually supporting people who had spontaneous episodes rather than suppressing the experience, was to actually encouraging people to go into it and through it.
Man, I just love that clip. It took me a while personally to really, resonate with the work of Stan Grof. I have to be honest, it wasn't until well into my adulthood that I really was able just to tap into that wealth of wisdom and compassion and knowledge and insight into not just the psychedelic state of being, but also the relationship between traditional psychiatry and non-ordinary states of consciousness, and how the two are best served working together. I just really enjoyed that. Wanted to share it with you guys. So let's get into it with Michael Pollan. Michael Pollan is author of the new book, This Is Your Mind on Plants, which explores the history and usage of mescaline, caffeine, and opium, and weaves together fantastic tales of these substances' place in our culture over the millennia, and why so much of our society continues to revolve around them, some on a mass level like caffeine and mescaline and peyote, which is still widely misunderstood. So here we go, Michael Pollan. Right, Michael Pollan, welcome to the MAPS podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Zach. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to see you. So this new book, This Is Your Mind on Plants, I think anybody who's used plants in a psychoactive way or otherwise has always had the notion that it seems a little insane and counterintuitive that some plants are illegal and some are not. But after reading your book, it really makes that case. Like the arbitrary associations that we give to some plants and not to others just seems more confusing than ever. And I just was wondering if you could shed some light on that, but Also, kind of give us some background and some history on why our cultures over the millennia have sort of adopted some plants with love and tradition while they've pushed others away.
Yeah, lots of cultures have gone to war on one plant and celebrated another. And really, that was one of the reasons it was important for me to include coffee and tea,
Mm.
since they're such innocent plants in our view and so important to us. But they're drug plants too. They produce a very powerful psychoactive. And so, one way to define the drug war is a war on certain plants. And opium is one, obviously, that we've gone to war on. It's, you could say it's arbitrary. It's not exactly arbitrary. I mean, the fact that it changes over time, which plants are demonized and which are not. There was a period during Prohibition where alcohol was a serious federal crime, but drinking tinctures of opium or cannabis was fine. Everybody did it. In fact, even the women who were the great temperance fighters, the Carrie Nations of this world, they would, work to ban alcohol and then kick back with these women's tonics that contained opium and cannabis. So things change. But in general, we tend to, first of all, every culture has some plant or fungus that they use to change consciousness. That's interesting in and of itself. I mean, this is something humans do. There is a universal desire to change consciousness.
Yeah.
It then gets complicated by acceptable and unacceptable ways. Like any kind of powerful drive, like the sex drive, like the need for food, we surround these important drives with lots of complicated feelings, symbolisms, metaphors, rituals, taboos. They're always taboos. They're taboos on eating, taboos on sex, taboos on drugs. In general, it seems like the ones that we celebrate are the ones that contribute to the smooth operation of the social and economic machine.
Like caffeine.
Caffeine's a great example.
Right.
Caffeine is really helpful to capitalism. It's really helpful to the Industrial Revolution. It just kind of greases the wheels and changes us in a way that makes us fit into the machine of capitalism much better. Makes it possible for us to work harder, more focused, to stay up later, have more energy, give us a pick-me-up when we're flagging and our work product would decline in quality or quantity. And then you've got other drugs that challenge the values of society in one way or another and are disruptive. And I don't use that in a negative way. I mean, things can be disrupted in a positive or negative way. But in the 60s, psychedelics were disruptive. And it's no wonder that there was a backlash against them because they threatened powerful interests. President Nixon believed that the reason that American boys were not, obeying the draft board and heading off to war was because they were taking acid and thinking for themselves. And
God forbid.
What'd you say?
God forbid.
God forbid, yeah. And his interpretation may well have been right. LSD was disruptive, and that's one of the reasons that the society and certainly the political world turned against it. But what's interesting now is the identity of psychedelics may be shifting from this image as being disruptive to the powers that be in the way things are to being a useful tool to help deal with this tremendous mental health crisis that we have. And I think that's kind of the work going on right now when we talk about the psychedelic renaissance. It's the reframing of certain psychedelics, not all of them, mostly psilocybin. But LSD will get swept up in it eventually, I think, and MDMA. And now they're doing more good than harm to the smooth working of society. And, that's the work that MAPS has been doing for these many years.
Yeah.
And certainly the success of the research is telling a very different kind of story. When you start thinking about these drugs as medicines, rather than as, I don't know, pleasure drugs or
even experiential drugs.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or even spiritual drugs. That's all more complicated for society than healing. And God knows we need healing. So I think in 10 years, we'll look back and we'll see the 60s image of psychedelics as the anomaly, and that they will once again be perceived as useful tools for, helping people overcome mental health difficulties.
Yeah, I sure hope so. And I love what you said, but what's interesting about that is that, especially in the Western mindset, is that sure, it gained acceptance because we gave it a very practical reason for it to gain acceptance. Mental health, it treats this issue, depression, it treats PTSD, the clinical trials say so. But still, the idea, which I encounter all the time in this modern psychedelic renaissance, is that the idea of mysticism or spiritual enhancement through certain plants is still, we're not quite there yet.
Well, I don't think that'll go away. I mean, I think that, there's a lot of concern that this medical path will close off other ways to use these medicines. And I don't think they will. I think they'll actually encourage it. And I think that the spiritual path is going to be very powerful. I think that, we already have 3 psychedelic churches, you might say, that, groups that have the right to use psychedelics as a sacrament. And there are more. I mean, I'm sure you're aware there are people forming new churches around psychedelics right now.
All the time.
In the hopes of being recognized by the government and receiving legal recognition. And I think they'll succeed. I think someday soon, you'll be able to join a psychedelic church, your medicine of choice, and have an experience in that context, in something that either looks like a church or looks nothing like a church. So that will go on. And then the underground is not going away. I don't think the medical approval of psilocybin or MDMA is going to destroy the market for people who want to do this on their own with an underground guide. So I think that all three paths are going to survive in one way or another, and I think they'll feed one another, actually.
Yeah, I think so too, and we're starting to see that a little bit. So, why did you choose caffeine, opium, and mescaline specifically as the 3 pillars to sort of revolve this conversation around?
Well, a couple of reasons. I mean, one is I wanted a representative example of the main classes of drugs, stimulants.
Oh, I love, by the way, what you said, downer, upper, and outer.
Outer, yes.
That's awesome, man. I've never heard that. That's great.
Outer's new, I think.
Yeah.
Downer and upper, but where do you put psychedelics in that? It's like, no, it's there. So I wanted the 3 big classes of drugs: psychedelic, stimulant, depressant. And those represent important, 3 important categories. But also, these just had great stories. I'm a storyteller, and they have really wonderful stories, historical stories, and for me, personal stories. The reason I wanted to do mescaline of all the possible psychedelics is I hadn't dealt with it in This Is Your Mind. In How to Change Your Mind. A book that hewed very close to the scientific research, and didn't look at indigenous or shamanic use of psychedelics very much at all. There's a little bit of ayahuasca in there, but basically it stayed very close to the research, because when I published it, this was still a very fringe topic. And the way to get ideas taken seriously in America is have some science behind them. At least with 60% of America. The other 40%, it doesn't matter. So the shamanic probably would have sold with them. But the whole time I was working on How to Change Your Mind, I would ask people what their favorite psychedelic was. People with a lot more experience than me, and I kept hearing over and over again, "Oh, mescaline! It's the king of materials." And I was surprised at that, because it's not around. Nobody seems to have had it in 20 or 30 years. Yeah. And so that piqued my curiosity. And then I was also looking for a good example of a native use of psychedelics in ceremony. And the Native American Church is just a fascinating story. And I think most Americans have vaguely heard that Indians have the right to use peyote as a sacrament. They won that right in 1994 after the Supreme Court had taken it away. but they know very little, and I knew very little about the history of winning that right, and the role of peyote in the healing of what is, one of the most traumatized populations on earth. And so I wanted to tell that story. I also have been, always sensitive to the different kind of cultural containers we use to put psychedelics in, because I think they're very important. And there was a kind of container in the 60s. It was pretty loose and had a lot of holes in it, but there was a container, more or less. But whether it was optimal, is a real question. I think part of what was happening in the 60s is these powerful substances arrived without an instruction manual, and people were trying everything to figure out how to use them. What are they good for? Yeah. The CIA had its program, your dad had his program, other people,
Kesey had his.
Kesey had his, and Huxley, and the psychiatrists working up in Canada, and they were all doing this giant R&D project to, like, what the hell is this good for?
Yeah. While using themselves as guinea pigs.
Well, self-experimentation was key, and it was very normal in science right up till the 60s. This may have been what killed it. So the question, so we didn't have an instruction manual, but of course there was one, and we didn't pay much attention to it, and that was the indigenous use of psychedelics. And Andrew Weil did, and Wade Davis. There were a handful of people who were very sensitive to what we might learn from indigenous use of psychedelics. And if you go back to Andy's first book, The Natural Mind, published in, I think, 1970, 71, 50 years ago, he talks a lot about the lessons of indigenous use of psychedelics. And I think they hold up. That there's always an elder involved. They're usually used in a group. They're never used casually, always with clear intention, and there's ritual around them. And that drugs used in this way are safer, and there are less adverse events. And so I wanted to look at, a case, and the Native American Church, I think, was the most interesting case.
I'd love, if I'm not really up to speed on the latest Native American Church activity, and whether or not, what the numbers are telling us about the use of peyote and mescaline within Native American cultures. What's happening with that? Is it still as active and as traditionally used as it's ever been?
It's more used. It's more active. The Native American Church is growing. The number of ceremonies is growing. And this has led to a problem. There's a shortage of peyote. And there's a very important conservation movement that's recently gotten started. There's a group called the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative, IPCI, which has been buying up land in the peyote gardens of Texas to protect it from ranching and development. The problem with peyote, there's a couple of problems with peyote. It grows in this very narrow band on both sides of the Rio Grande in southern Texas and across the border. Doesn't seem to grow anywhere else. It's very slow growing. It takes 15 years from seed to usable button. So as the Native American Church has grown, and as poaching has also, become more common, the population of wild peyote is crashing. And this is a huge threat to Native Americans. And it's led to conflict with the decriminalized nature movement, which seeks to decriminalize all plants and doesn't want to make distinctions among plants. Although oddly enough, they leave opium out of their list of plants that should be decriminalized. So they're arguing for a blanket decriminalization. Native American Church is like, not this one, please. We kind of like the law the way it is. We have the legal right to use peyote. Non-natives don't. And there is some protection in that. And I'm sympathetic to that point of view. I would not encourage anyone to use peyote. We've taken enough from Native Americans.
There is always there's always that argument, and sometimes it's very valid that white people, even with the best intentions, go in and fuck up, culturally appropriate indigenous rituals and and there we have it, and screw it up. And so I'm sympathetic towards it
but
too.
This is more than cultural appropriation. This is not just taking the rituals. This is taking the stuff.
Yeah.
And there's a limited amount of stuff. I mean, you can argue about cultural appropriation, but it doesn't necessarily diminish what you're imitating. Or,
sure.
you know, it may be disrespectful, but we're talking about a real physical appropriation or material appropriation here. So I think, you know, look, mescaline is a very interesting substance, and if people are interested in it, they have two alternatives to peyote, and they're good alternatives. One is synthetic mescaline, which is in short supply. I'm not sure exactly why. I mean, there's some downsides to mescaline. It's a very long trip. It's like 14 hours, and you'll be done with it before it's done with you. And
I can attest to that. That is very true.
And then there's San Pedro or Wachuma. This is a cactus that's very easy to grow, particularly out here in California. Although I was doing a podcast with someone in London, and he had it growing on his mantle. I saw it behind him. So you can grow it indoors also. And this produces, it's milder than peyote, but you know, it's a way to get peyote and to get it legally, because unlike peyote, which is illegal for non-natives to grow, Wachuma is not. San Pedro is not. You can grow it. You can buy it online. Where you cross the line into illegality is when you cook it, essentially, and then you're manufacturing a scheduled substance. So you know, it was very hard to penetrate the Native American church. I mean, they're secretive, suspicious, for good reason. They see the psychedelic renaissance going on, and they think that maybe these drug companies are going to come for their peyote at some point and discover its value and want to use it. So it took me a few tries before I found people who were willing to really talk about the kind of healing that happens in a peyote ceremony. And they're very moving stories. And it's a beautiful ceremony. It's a very rigorous ceremony. I mean, you're sitting up all night, staring at the fire, no lying down, no stretching your legs. It's tough. It's really tough. There's nothing Dionysian about it. Whereas on the Mexican side of the border, the Huicholi people, who also use peyote in their ceremony, have a much more Dionysian ceremony, and they're dancing and having visions, and a
lot of music is involved.
A lot of music, colorful, wonderful clothing, and then they sacrifice a bull at the end of the whole thing. I mean, so it's a very different spirit. And part of the reason for that is that Native Americans were trying to disguise their ceremony from us, from white Americans, as, you know, sober, Christian, Protestant. So it wasn't going to be too wild. They had a much wilder ceremony that got a lot of people killed, and that was the ghost dance. And that was so frightening to the white authorities that they crushed it. But the irony is they had two rituals to deal with their dislocation in the 1880s, and the fact they were being pushed onto Indian territories in Oklahoma, and the fact that their boys were being kidnapped and put in boarding school. And they were really on the verge of cultural annihilation. And two religious movements sprung up at the same time around 1880-81. One was the ghost dance, which was this messianic, gigantic dance. You know, there'd be a circle that would be half a mile around. Wow. And people would enter a trance state, and it was all based on this vision someone had that the white people would be eliminated from the Americas, and that the old world would be restored. And this is exactly what led to the massacre at Wounded Knee. And I mean, this freaked out the authorities. At the same time, there was this peyote service, which took place inside a tent, was incredibly sedate. And for a long time, the authorities let that thrive. I mean, there were various efforts to close it down, but and the reason was that it had a kind of Christian flavor, or they pretended to have a Christian flavor. It's not really clear,
right?
But it felt a little more like a Quaker meeting than a ecstatic revival. And
So,
so the irony is that of these two, religious movements, the one with the psychedelics was the more acceptable one.
yeah, so hearing you talk about this, does sound pretty compelling to, for the growing psychedelic community, I might add. I mean, I think it's growing at a higher rate than it has since the 1960s, about really leaving some of these indigenous practices alone and kind of moving over into lanes that are more accessible and so on and so forth. I mean, we're seeing a similar pattern repeat as with the peyote poaching and scarcity with bufo, 5-MeO,
Yes,
that's extracted
right.
from the toads. Another conservation issue, right? So, I heard you, I mean, you just said it, but I also heard you say it I think on your NPR talk that, the best thing for the psychedelic community to do would be to leave it alone, right?
Yeah, when it comes to peyote, I feel strongly. And, or if you're patient, grow it. There's nothing, that doesn't take anything away from anyone.
Right, sure.
Peyote seeds and, in 15 years, now maybe your drug taking years will be over by then, but you can bequeath it to your children.
Well, let's talk a little bit about opium, because opium also has just a fantastic and rich, colorful, mythical history of, the opium trade routes through Southeast Asia and Central Asia, and opium dens of ancient lore in China and Thailand, and some of which I presume still exist. But opium, as we know it, it seems to have sort of fallen into two very rigid categories. Heroin, which is by all, conventional wisdom, is deemed a very dangerous, high-risk drug, or prescription opiates. And I've always been a cognitive libertarian in the sense that I've always believed, hey, we have the right to change our own consciousness as we see fit. But in 2019, 50,000, I believe, right? People died from.
I think it was more than that. I think it was a record. I think it was 93,000.
Oh, wow. 93,000
yeah,
people died.
Maybe that was for 2020. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean,
pandemic made it much worse.
So many people dying from, legal prescription opiates.
Well, no, they're not all. It's not all from legal. I mean, they start with legal prescription, but
and then they run out of it. Then they have to go to heroin.
Right, and most of the overdoses have to do with street heroin that's laced with fentanyl.
Right,
and people don't know what kind of dose they're getting, and they're making mistakes. And or you have people who've kicked the habit and then lapsed. And people assume that you go back to your previous dose, and that's not true. You start from scratch, and so people take too much when they lapse. So there's a lot of reasons. I mean, but the fact is, the opioid crisis was sparked by legal opioids and being given in prescriptions. People would get addicted. Not everyone, by the way. I mean, lots of people use opiates without getting addicted. It's important. It's not automatic, which is what I kind of assumed wrongly. Carl Hart has written about this well.
Very well done, too.
In drug use for grown-ups. But then their doctors, when doctors realize that they're being hawked for more prescriptions, that their patient's addicted, and they cut them off. And that's when they turn to the black market. And that's when you run into problems. But it's important to understand that most of the problems associated with heroin addiction have to do with the fact that it's illegal. That if it were legal, if you could stay on prescription opiates, you would not have these overdoses. You would not have contaminated needles. You would not have, so, that's the argument of the harm reduction folks, which is that if you want to reduce the harms, you have to make it legal, or at least decriminalize it, so people know what they're putting in their arms, or they're not putting anything in their arms. They're getting pills. So it's a complicated story, but the reason I wanted to tell it is because I think it exposes one of the larger fallacies of the drug war, which is to say that the public, the drug war was sold to us as a public health campaign, right? Okay. These dangerous substances were on the loose. They were, frying our children's brains. And
this is your brain on drugs.
Right. And, that's why I called the book, This Is Your Mind on Plants. And I was playing with that. But but in fact, there's a lot of evidence it was a political war, not a public health campaign. And the opioid crisis suggests, I mean, look at this is the biggest public health problem tied to drugs, is this, killing, 93,000 people last year. And it's rooted in legal drugs, not illegal drugs. And if you go back to 1996, and we can explain why I'm particularly interested in that year, you would find that there are only like 5,000 opiate addicts in the country then. It's astonishing. Wow. It wasn't a big problem. Heroin addicts, I should say. And now, I don't know how many we have, but we're in the hundreds of thousands of opiate addicts. And so, as Purdue Pharma, Johnson & Johnson, these are the companies that really heavily promoted opiates to people on the lie that their products like OxyContin were safer, less addictive, which it turns out we now know they knew was not true.
The opposite was true.
Yeah. And they were essentially bribing doctors to make these prescriptions, and they knew, they saw that more opiates were being sold into certain zip codes than there were people there. It was really shameful behavior. Anyway, I tell that story because I was growing opium poppies in 1996.
Yeah. I love this story. Please tell it. Yeah.
And I had, I was writing essays about gardening at the time for the New York Times and Harper's Magazine. And a friend of mine, an editor, had sent me this small press, underground press book called Opium for the Masses by a man named Jim Hogshire. And I said, oh, this is cool. I'm going to try this. I mean, I'd already grown cannabis, had a close call there too. But this seemed so easy. And I had no idea that the poppy seeds I could get in my garden center, Papaver somniferum, were opium poppies, and that it really wasn't that hard to turn them into opium. And this was like hidden in plain sight. And, to a curious gardener, this was irresistible. So I start exchanging emails with Jim Hogshire and asking him for horticultural advice, and does he have any seeds we could swap? And I plant my opium poppy seeds, and they're coming up, and they're quite beautiful at every stage. And I get word that Jim Hogshire has been arrested on drug charges, and that a SWAT team burst into his apartment and threw him up against the wall. And the case was based on two things: possession of dried poppy seed heads purchased at a florist shop, okay, something that's legal everywhere, that you could buy today at any florist shop, because they're quite beautiful, and a copy of his book. And the book proved the crime, which was intent to manufacture a narcotic. And it turns out that it's perfectly fine to grow opium if you don't realize you're growing a scheduled substance and you have no intention of making anything out of it. But as soon as you form that intention, or even acquire that knowledge that you're knowingly growing a narcotic, you're breaking federal law. And I realized, oh my God, I'm doing the same thing he's doing. And they have his hard drive, and I'm on his hard drive. And I was like, ah. So I didn't know what to do. I started doing investigation. I'm a journalist, and started calling around. And I gradually learned that the DEA did indeed have this very quiet campaign to crush what they saw as an incipient fad, that this book was going to tell everybody, and everybody's going to be growing opium, and we'd have this opioid crisis. Right. And so they were going around to seed sellers and telling them not to carry Papaver somniferum, even though it was perfectly legal. It's the same poppy seeds on bagels and in your spice aisle. They ripped up the poppies in the garden at Monticello, in Jefferson's garden, which is always thought that was too dangerous. They were going around to flower wholesalers and the trade magazine of the Florist Association, telling them to tell everybody to stop selling Papaver somniferum, even though it was legal, because this was going to get out of hand, slippery slope. Anyway, while this is all going on, while the DEA is focused on a bunch of gardeners fooling around with poppies to make what is really a fairly mild narcotic tea, which is served at funerals in the Middle East to lift the pain of grieving, and is an interesting experience, but not overwhelming in any way. And I seriously doubt anyone's overdosed from poppy tea. You'd have to drink a lot of it. But at the same time, OxyContin that same summer is being introduced by Purdue Pharma and sold to us, and sowing the real seeds of disaster, which is to say the opioid crisis. And that irony
that's fantastic,
irresistible. So this chapter becomes a parable of the drug war and the absurdity of the drug war, and hopefully we'll drive another stake in it.
Wait. So what did you do with your poppies? I didn't catch that.
So I was faced with this dilemma. I had already broken the law, and once they were ripe, I decided, well, in for a dime, in for a dollar, I'm going to try it. So I made poppy tea, and in the article I describe how you make it. It's not complicated. If you have dried heads, you basically put them in a spice mill or coffee grinder and pulverize them, and you make a tea. You soak them in water for a while, and it's very bitter, like most of these alkaloids, but it works. You can also cut them up fresh or dried and put them in vodka and make it a tincture, which is what laudanum is. So also very easy. The government has wanted us to believe that you can only grow poppies in like Afghanistan or Turkey or countries where you have armies of 10-year-olds who can slit the poppy. But in fact, during the Civil War, Southerners grew opium poppies to create opium as a painkiller for the soldiers. And it grows perfectly well here. It was a cash crop in upstate New York for many years. They just wanted to get it out of the country. It's too bad because it's a beautiful crop.
It is a beautiful crop.
So when I finished my article, I was faced with this dilemma. Obviously, it was a confession to a crime. And so we had it lawyered by Harper's Magazine had assigned the piece. It was a very long piece. I'd spent a year working on it. Okay, I was a freelance writer counting on this big paycheck. And the first lawyer who read it came up to me, drove up to our house in Connecticut, sat my wife and I down. He's wearing a suit. Suddenly there's a criminal defense lawyer on my couch telling me that I could be a defendant. And he said, you're crazy to publish this. You're confessing to violating the Controlled Substances Act. Here's what could happen to you. And he lays it out: 5 to 20 year sentence, $1 million fine, and they could confiscate your land because you were growing it on your land. And under the asset forfeiture laws, your property can be guilty of a crime, even if whether you are or not. And I was like, so they had the power to wreck my life completely. Mm. When Rick MacArthur, the publisher of Harper's, hears the story, the lawyer's advice, he's outraged, and he says, well, we need a new lawyer. So he goes out and hires a First Amendment lawyer, a very prominent one named Victor Kovner. And Victor reads the piece and comes to the opposite conclusion. He says, you must publish this piece for the good of the Republic. This is exactly what the First Amendment exists for, commentary on the government. He did tell me, though, that there are 2 passages in the piece that would be most antagonistic to the government and most likely to get me in hot water. And one was the description of how to make the poppy tea, and the other was the trip report. What does it feel like to take it? And he said, if you really wanted to minimize your risk, you could cut those sections. And that's what I decided to do. And I regretted doing it. It was self-censorship, and I felt bad about it. But I had my family to consider too. I mean, this could have been a disaster for us. So in the end, I cut those passages, but I did publish the piece. Harper's kind of indemnified me up and down. I mean, to the extent of like, not only would they defend me, they would pay me a salary while I was in jail, or pay my wife a salary while I was in jail. And they would buy me a new house if it was confiscated. So very generous on the part of the publisher. And with that in hand, and with the cuts in hand, I decided to publish. And, knock on wood, nothing happened, except poppy sales rose for a few years, although they became hard to find because the industry was intimidated from selling them. So I've always wanted to republish the piece in its proper form. And I'd noticed that it was the most popular piece on my website, and it's from 1997. So I thought there was some interest in it. And so I was able to publish it the way it was meant to be. And I surrounded it with this other story of what else was going on in 1996 that we didn't know about at the time.
That's awesome, man. In the end, cognitive dissonance wins,
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, I know. It was it's a historical irony of tremendous proportions.
So,
and it was all the same summer too. Is kind of incredible.
So, that's just a fantastic juxtaposing, that year and everything that happened in that year. So fast forward all of these years later, I think any reasonably sane person, and new Gallup polls suggest this is true, that most Americans will admit war on drugs has failed in some capacity or another, right? I want to look at it holistically, not get to the psychedelic exceptionalism thing where, psychedelics are kind of making more headway than other drugs. But what's it going to take for the war on drugs to completely end as we know it, and for us to move into a sort of more accepted, state of how these plants and chemicals play the role that they play in our society? What's it going to take?
Well, I just wrote a piece about this for the Times where I'm talking about the end of the drug war and what comes after. And I think it'll be hard work, actually. It's one thing to end the drug war and decriminalize this, but then you're going to have these powerful substances that have blessings but also have problems. They do lead to problems, even in the absence of a drug war. There's a reason that they've been targeted in some cases. Heroin is a good example. I think that the voters will end the drug war. They're already doing it. I think what happened in Oregon is really significant in 2020, which is that there were two measures on the ballot. Yeah. One was Measure 110, which decriminalized all drugs, even hard drugs. People who are arrested will be channeled into therapy treatment rather than incarcerated. That's a huge deal. And then the other thing that happened in Oregon is Proposition 109, which specifically legalized psilocybin therapy and actually obligates the state Department of Health to train and certified psychedelic guides. This is incredible. And licensed growers of magic mushrooms. If these two measures work out, if Oregon is able to, essentially regulate psychedelic therapy successfully and doesn't have any problems, whether with the FDA or who knows what else, and if this decriminalization works and crime goes down, incarceration rates go down, people are successfully treated who are addicted, I think that model will spread, and we'll move toward a Portugal-style, legalization.
But the one thing that is missing, now these are all fantastic steps, but one thing that is missing is the commerce aspect of it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm 99% sure Proposition 110 didn't affect the buying and selling of it. That is still a legal gray area.
It's still illegal. Oh yeah, no,
yeah.
This.
So yes, you can have it, but you can't buy it.
And you can only have, small amounts for personal use, maybe social sharing. I'm not sure. Yeah, there's no commerce, and I think that's great. I don't think certain of these drugs. I don't think psychedelics should be commercialized.
Oh, no, I agree, but I'm not even talking about psychedelics. I mean, like heroin and say crack. I mean, I'm a former recovering substance abuse user, and the streets of Los Angeles, as I know them, are dominated by the crack and heroin trade, Yeah. And sure, these days it's not the same, if you get busted with, a little bit of recreational crack or heroin, you get sent to treatment and things like that. But it doesn't take away the gang warfare, the violence, all the guns and money that it took to get that drug there in the first place.
Yes, and I know, and
Yeah.
a really successful end of the drug war would end that marketplace, and so does that mean you have to create a legal marketplace, and who runs it? As
That's
I
tricky.
understand it, in Portugal, I think the government runs it. I mean, or heroin treatment in Switzerland is interesting. They haven't
Yeah.
decriminalized all drugs, but they have a program where if you're a heroin addict and you're arrested, they put you in a program where they actually give you prescription heroin.
Yeah.
So the government is producing it or buying it, and you get it at the drugstore, and you have, you know, your proper dose. You're not going to overdose, and then they go to work on fixing your life. And so they look, you know, they give you a good job if you don't have one. They improve your housing if you don't have housing. They give you therapy. And their thinking is that the conditions of your life have to change before you can give up the habit. And that the habit is the result of having, you know, problems in your life, economic misery or trauma or whatever it is. And so they deal with that first and then deal with the habit, which I think makes a lot of sense.
Fantastic. That makes so much sense.
I can't imagine Americans going for that. You know, that we give people heroin and then give them better jobs. It doesn't sound like us.
Yeah, right. I mean, so much of the drug war really is because we don't like the people who use them. You know, we're not about to go help them.
We target certain populations, definitely.
Yeah.
It is a campaign against certain populations, and obviously it's fallen harder on communities of color than anybody else. And we now know, you know, it was very political. It was the government's attempt to have tools to disrupt certain communities, and that's Nixon is admitting.